Good afternoon. Got it? My name's Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. And on behalf of Brookings Mountain West and AI, I'd like to welcome all of you to this panel on Democrats and demography. I'm sure that all of us are going to be watching or listening to the debate tonight, and those performances will clearly be important. But the ultimate winner in both parties is going to be facing a challenging electoral landscape that's being shaped in many ways by changing demography. We're going to be discussing those changes today with the best in the business. Specifically, our panel will examine the challenge that the Democratic Party faces nationally and in the Mountain States West in 2016 and beyond. I'm sure that they'll have thoughts about the GOP as well. Predicting future partisan advantage from demographic trends has a long and somewhat checkered history. Nearly a half century ago, Kevin Phillips turned his hobby of studying voting patterns in America into his best-selling book, The Emerging Republican Majority. In the last decade or so, we've had other books on the coming Republican realignment, the emerging Democratic majority, the lost majority, the emerging Republican advantage, and most recently, the submerged Democratic majority. To get us started this morning about what's really occurring in our politics, let me introduce our panelists. I think you all have their bios, and so these introductions will be very short. My colleague Norm Ornstein, who will be today's moderator, is a resident scholar at AEI and a longtime observer and scholar of politics and Congress and author, most recently, of It's Even Worse Than It Looks. Rob Lang is a professor at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas and executive director of Brookings Mountain West, a Brookings Institution senior fellow whose specialties include suburban studies, real estate, geographic and demographic analysis. Sam Sturgeon is president of Demographic Intelligence, a consulting firm that publishes the U.S. fertility forecast and works on local, regional, and group demographics. Finally, Rui Teixeira is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and the Center for American Progress, and the author of a number of important studies on changing electoral trends. Lest you think that deep partisan divisions characterize everything that goes on in Washington, let me tell you a little about the work that some of us on this panel have been doing for almost a decade. We have different points of view and different interpretations of the data, but we work closely and congenial and agree on the basic outlines of the demographic changes. Rob Lang and Rui Teixeira were part of an AEI Brookings project on demography that began in 2007. Then again, under Rob's guidance, we collaborated in 2012 on a deep dive into demography and attitudes of the Mountain States West. Earlier this year, AEI, Brookings, and the Center for American Progress joined together on a 3-year project generously supported by the Hewlett Foundation called States of Change, the Demographic Evolution of the Electorate, 1974 to 2060. In the report, we look at demographic changes nationally and in all of our 50 states. Before beginning, I'd like to thank a number of people who are here with us today and made this event possible. First, it was a great pleasure to work with Brookings Mountain West. Rob Lang and his team, Bill Brown and Chrissy Nanton, were especially helpful at every stage. We're also grateful to Wolfgang Puck for opening this wonderful restaurant to us for lunch. And on AEI's end, we couldn't have done this without the AEI media team, Judy Stecker and Meg Cahill. Last of all, Norm's and my assistant, Heather Sims, only a year out of college, yet with a level of professionalism and competence and good cheer that never ceases to astound me. Thank you all for coming, and let me turn it over to Norm Ornstein.
Thank you, Carlin, and I'll add my thanks to everybody. In the last couple of days, I've done the nerd version of Taxi Cab Confessions, and cab drivers open up here, and my cab driver on the way over told me he was a very strong Trump supporter. But he also proudly said that he had a bumper sticker on his cab that said, "Run, Hillary, run," which kind of surprised me until I saw it was on the front bumper of his car. I did tell him that I thought if he succeeded and Trump became president, he would be very disappointed because within a few months he would leave us for a younger country. The cab on the way over, those of you who have passed by or been at the Wynn, of course, there's this huge video out front heralding the debate. with a big picture of Hillary Clinton, followed by a big picture of Bernie Sanders, followed by the words on the undercard of Lincoln Chafee, Martin O'Malley, and Jim Webb. And I feel sorry for them, especially for Lincoln Chafee, who's been trying to get some traction. Bernie Sanders came up with a great slogan, "Feel the burn." When Link tried "Feel the chafe," it just didn't work. So, just a couple of words of introduction. We all know the top line of the demographic changes occurring in the country. We know that the United States is relentlessly moving from a majority white country to a majority minority country. We know the population is aging. We know at the top level what those things should mean for our politics. But what our panel today and the marvelous report that Carlin referenced, which let me hold up, States of Change, which I recommend to all of you, shows is that these are not uniform changes occurring in the same way, at the same level, and with the same pace all across the country, that they're very different depending on states and regions. And we also know that demography is not destiny in a lot of ways, that there are twists and turns here that may determine our politics and the future of the parties. It is a perfect time to begin to discuss those things as the Democratic Party meets here for its first debate with a very different political landscape, both in Washington, in Congress, as it's going through full meltdown phase, and out on the campaign trail as we head to a pivotal presidential election with all the other congressional elections ahead. What does this tell us about 2016 as we dig into the demography? And what does it tell us about the future of our country and its politics? We'll talk about it at the national level, and we'll dig into states and regions. And let me start with an initial presentation by Rui Teixeira.
Thank you, Norm. Can everyone hear me well? More or less? Okay. So today, as Carlin mentioned, we have collaborated on this States of Change project with Brookings and the American Enterprise Institute Center for American Progress, where I work. The results, as she pointed out, from the first year are in this fabulous report, and I will be retailing a few of those findings. We also are now working on the second year of the project, and what we're doing there is one of the things we're doing is we're taking the demographic changes that we've estimated and we're applying them to future elections, presidential elections, under a variety of different scenarios to see what the implications of those changes are depending on the assumptions you make about the support levels and turnout in the future electorate. But first let me go over three big changes that underlie the work we did and that will be reflected in our simulations. First of all, if you look at your handout, the three maps are of the browning of America. So the first map, 2014, shows the states are colored by what percent minority they have. As you can see, only 4 states are majority minority today, 50% or more. California, New Mexico, Texas, and Hawaii, that's it. But that will change pretty rapidly over the next several decades. If you look at the next map, 2040, we're going to add 9 more states that will be majority minority by 2040, for making a total of 13. We're going to add Nevada, which is topical, I guess, and that'll be in 2019, the very next majority minority state, according to our projections. We'll also add by 2040, Arizona, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, Maryland, New Jersey, and New York. So all those states should be majority minority by 2040, and many of them quite a bit before that. Finally, if you take the lens out far enough to 2060, according to our estimations, there should be 22 majority minority states in the United States by 2060, including 7 of the 10 largest states, 11 of the largest 15, covering 2/3 of the U.S. population in these majority minority states. We'll be adding by that time Washington State, Colorado, Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, Connecticut, and Illinois. So that'll be 22 by that time. And by the time, and in addition, it's worth mentioning that another 10 states will have more than 40% minority, including such states that seem a little unlikely, of Kansas, Utah, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. So this is a massive level of change unfolding over a period of a number of decades. Just looking at it from the top line national level, we'll be majority minority overall in the country by 2044. We'll be about 57% minority by 2060. And at that point, children in the United States, that is those under 18, should be about 2/3 minority. So I think that gives you a sense of the browning of America and just how rapidly it's taking place and the kinds of places where it's going to wind up having a significant effect. Now, browning of America isn't the only change going on. Another important change is the graying of America. We're getting older by and large, especially as the huge baby boom generation ages and goes through the sort of python of the age distribution of the country and of the electorate. Now, the second chart here that's labeled Figure 5 for some reason, but let's call it the second chart, the graying of the U.S. electorate. This is for eligible voters, those 18 or over who are citizens. Back in 1980, close to the peak of the baby boom entering their adult years, 29% of eligible voters were 18 to 29, and only 17% were over 65, were seniors. Today, we're just about equal. We're 21% seniors and 21% 18 to 29, almost pretty much exactly the same. But then, if you take it out to the year 2060, we're going to continue on this aging trend, and by the time we hit 2060, we should only have 16% of eligible voters that are under 30, and 29% that are seniors, that are over 65. So in a sense, exactly reversing the distribution that we saw in 1980 at the height of the baby boom coming into the electorate. So that's a second trend, graying of the electorate. And looking at the third chart here, which is labeled diversification of U.S.'s senior electorate, this is senior eligible voters, and I call this the browning of the gray. I think when a lot of people think about the graying of America, they think of this sort of tsunami of white seniors sort of washing over the country and taking up a lot of space, or maybe gathering in retirement villages, whatever they do. But that actually is not quite right. We will have a lot more older people proportionally, but most, increasingly they will not be white. Right now, about 22% of senior eligible voters are minorities. By the time we hit 2060, that'll double to 44% of senior eligible voters who are minorities. What that means is that 3/4 of the growth we'll see in the senior population to the year 2040 will be from minorities. And if you look over the entire time period to 2060, essentially all of the growth in the senior population comes from minorities, not from whites. And in fact, we're not that far off peak white seniors already. We're at about 16.5% today. Sometime around 2040, we'll hit like 17.5% of the total electorate will be white seniors. So the increase in the white senior share of eligible voters is actually quite modest, and what's really going to drive that increasing share of seniors in the electorate is minorities, not whites. So that's the browning of the gray. Now, the last part last chart I want to talk about here is that shows some projected electoral results for Nevada, Colorado, Ohio, and Florida. And these are part of what we're doing here in the second year of the project, looking at the political and policy implications of the shifts in the distribution of race and age among the electorate. So these are different scenarios that take into account the changing racial distribution, the changing age distribution, and the changing distribution of age, of race within age, so the interaction between the two. So in other words, we look at every race age group and we do a simulation that's based on taking into account their political behavior and their density in the electorate. So this is a fairly sophisticated series of scenarios. But one thing I do want to emphasize here is that these are simulations. They are not predictions of what's going to happen in 2016 or 2020 or 2024. We're simply taking what we understand to be the likely distribution of the eligible electorate over time, and we're walking into it different assumptions about turnout levels, about support levels for the different political parties, and so on. So these are as-if scenarios. They're not what we think is going to happen in 2016. They're what could happen if certain assumptions hold true, and I'll detail those in a moment. One other thing I should add about these scenarios, they're based on race and age and the interaction between the two. As I said, there's a couple of things we don't take into account, at least on the scenarios presented here, which in some ways biases the predictions a little bit in a slightly pro-Republican way. We're not looking at the changing education distribution within whites, which favors college-educated whites over non-college whites. College-educated whites are much better for Democrats than non-college whites, and they're the group that is growing. We're also not taking into account of cohorts. In other words, we're assuming that when people get to be a certain age, they vote like the same people today do at that age. But we know that generations differ. So millennials, as they age into their 30s and 40s, may in fact vote quite differently than voters today do in their 30s and 40s. Same thing for seniors and so on. So we're not taking into account that cohort effect. If you take into account the cohort effect, since younger voters tend to be more Democratic, that's also something that slightly favors, slightly favors the Republicans under these scenarios. So this is a sneak preview of our big report coming up in February, and I'm just going to mention a few states here. The first one you see here is Nevada, and we've got 3 scenarios here for 2016, 2020, and 24. The first one is, what if everything's like 2012? What if the turnout rates by race and by age are the same? What if the support levels between Democrats and Republicans are as they were in 2012? What would be the result? And as you can see, in each of these cases, because of the nature of demographic change, the Democrats would do better in these states than they did in 2012. The second scenario says, well, okay, let's keep everything the same except one thing. Let's say the Republicans do significantly better among new minorities, that is, among Hispanics and Asians. Let's say they increase their support by 7.5 percentage points, or looked at another way, they decrease their margin of their deficit among these groups by 15 points. So that's a fairly healthy assumption. And then the third scenario is, well, let's hold everything constant, but let's say Republicans do a lot better among white voters, like 5 percentage points better, which in other words would be the equivalent of assuming on a national level that the Republicans get 64% of the white vote in 2016, which is basically Reagan levels, 1984. So those are the 3 scenarios. Now, if you look at Nevada, you can see that none of these scenarios really matter. The state goes Democratic. Obviously, if things stay like they were in 2012, there's a decrease if the new minorities go for Republicans at a greater rate, but it doesn't change the outcome. And even if you increase the white support for Republicans in the state by 5 points, it still doesn't go a Republican in 2016 and then increasingly Democratic in 2020 and 24. Now, if you look at Colorado, you can see that under the 2012 scenario, Democrats do better election by election. If you look at the new minorities giving more support to the Republicans, the state continues to go Democratic, though by slightly less in 2016, and then it picks up again. But what really makes a difference here is the increased white support. If Colorado voted 5 points more among whites for the GOP in 2016, our simulations suggest the Republicans would in fact take that state. Now, demographic change would put that back to about a tie by 2024, but at least in 2016, if you get that increment of white support in Colorado and everything else remains the same, we would expect that the Republicans would take the state. Now, Ohio is interesting because it doesn't obviously do a little bit better if everything is like 2012. There's almost no difference if the Republicans do 7.5 points better among Hispanics and Asians, and the simple reason for that is there aren't very many. So it's only a very slight decrease in their support. But what really makes a difference is the white support. If you get Reagan-era levels of support, Reagan 1984 levels of support among whites in Ohio, that state flips Republican in 2016 and stays there, according to our simulations, despite demographic change, through 2024. Florida is, I think, obviously the kind of the big prize here. Obviously, I mean, if things, as we would expect, remain as they were in 2012, the Democrats win again and over several cycles by a little bit more. If you change the new minority support, Hispanics and Asians, so that the Republican margin deficit decreases by 15 points, it flips the state in 2016 and 2020, and then by 2024 it's back to about a tie, but clearly it would be effective. And also you see, as in Ohio, that if you increase white support by 5 points among Florida whites for the GOP, they would flip the state in 2016, 2020, and 2024. So that's some basic results from our simulations. Again, they're not predictions of what's going to happen, but they're simulations, estimations of what could happen if certain assumptions hold true about the electorate's behavior in 2016 and beyond, and given the level of demographic change we expect to see in the electorate moving forward. So hopefully that's a little bit of food for thought, and obviously I'll welcome your questions about any of this, though I'm under threat of death. I'm not allowed to let too many more results from our report out, but you could probably coax a few more for me. Anyway, I'll turn it over to somebody else.
Thank you, Rui. Rui mentioned the graying of America, and I should tell you this is something Norm and I think a lot about. We've been sitting next to each other for 36 years at AEI, and one of the things that comes with the graying of America is forgetting things, and I forgot to make two announcements. First, you can tweet this event at Demographics 2016, and the video of this will be available on both of our websites, Brookings Mountain West and AEI, later in the week. Thank you. Norm.
Thanks, Carlin, and thank you, Rui. Obviously, one of the things that's emerging is that linear projections from broader trends don't work necessarily, and the future is not foreordained. Taking a bigger dive into some of the states and regions, let me turn to Rob.
Sure. Well, welcome to Las Vegas and to the Sun Belt. And the reason I mentioned the word Sun Belt is that it was coined in that book by Kevin Phillips on the coming Republican majority. And the reason that the Republicans were going to be in the majority was that the Sun Belt was going to get them there. In other words, the politics of 1960s, late 1960s, 1968, the book was published, 1970s, 1980s were, almost like a Dallas episode from that era, if I'm dating myself here. The Ewing Ranch and the sort of Dallas and Texas and Florida and California and Orange County, California, which is now majority minority and has been so since 2003. And a place like Las Vegas was a reliably small, and a lot of the western states out here like Colorado and New Mexico were reliably small states that mostly went for the Republicans in a block that was nearly resembling the Sun Belt in the East. Now, fast forward 5 decades, and things have changed. And you're at ground zero right here in Las Vegas of that change. Just to put this in perspective, the college that I teach at, UNLV, is the second most diverse national university in the United States. We're coming for you, Rutgers, Newark. We're going to get you. And when they say diverse, and this is the U.S. News World Report ranking, and if you look at the methods, what's interesting is it's not just that you have a single large block of one minority and then you have majority. It's that you have majority, minority, and multiple minorities. In fact, it's like a UN effect. What is the chance that on a daily basis at my campus, you will run into somebody from a different background than your own, different racial, ethnic background? The chances on UNLV, out of 260-something national universities, are number 2. And that demographic, the people who are in their 20s and younger in some cases in the university, reflects the sort of emergence of a place like Las Vegas in the larger Sun Belt in this new profile. And how big has the Sun Belt gotten? Well, as it arrives at its dominant position, so most of the largest cities in the U.S. now are in the South and the West. In the 1950s, it was all up in the Northeast Midwest. In fact, there wasn't even a baseball team until the Los Angeles Trolley Dodgers from Brooklyn moved out west. That's what my parents called them, the Trolley Dodgers. And there was no team playing west of St. Louis. And I joke sometimes back at HUD, at the Housing and Urban Development Office in Washington, D.C., they know of no city west of St. Louis to this day, because there's this sort of care and feeding of the sort of northeastern cities in that regard. But I assure you that most of the largest cities in the United States are actually in the South and the West, the LAs, the San Antonios now, and so on. In fact, tellingly, I wrote a book in the latter part of last decade called Boom Burbs. And Boom Burbs included Henderson, Nevada, and there's a councilwoman March over there from Henderson. I observed that Peoria, Arizona is now bigger than Peoria, Illinois. And there used to be an expression, an old vaudeville expression, will it play in Peoria? It meant, sure, you could do a show in New York City, but it might be too avant-garde. If you want to take the show nationally, you have to be able to bring it out to the heartland, and the heartland meant the Midwest. And the heartland meant a state like Illinois or Ohio, which were determinative of all these decades in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, through the middle and later 20th century, of who won the presidency, who could play in Peoria. And for years, I think that meant that part of the country. The new question is, who plays in Peoria, Arizona? Who plays in Mesa, Arizona? Who plays in Henderson, Nevada? Who plays in Plano, Texas, and so on? And who plays in Orlando, Florida? Because that's the new Peoria. That's the new space where the majority of Americans live. And the interesting thing is that the very space that the Republicans relied on to deliver their coming majority that they did see for the next several decades, in the 70s, 80s certainly, they were in the dominant position, is the very space now that its demographic weight as it goes diverse ends up in the simulations that Rui's talking about. And we're going to hold you to those, by the way. You think you present this in Las Vegas and just slip out of town and not deliver these states? Because we're counting on these states, okay? I'm sure the DNC is watching this. So just a few final comments about this state and some of the neighboring states. So we're in Clark County, Nevada. It's the metro for Las Vegas. It's over 2 million people, and it's grown from a tiny speck of a metropolis back when, in 1968, the coming Republican majority was written. It has doubled its Asian population in a single decade from 2000 to 2010. It is most of the state. It's nearly 3/4 of the state of Nevada, and it is perhaps the most diversifying part of any swing state. It's probably the fastest diversifying part of any swing state. And here is a fun fact you should know. So if you look at the map that Rui passed out, and the first part of it, it shows the states, and notice that Iowa and New Hampshire do not seem to reflect the future based on where they head in terms of diversity. All right, just take note of that when I say this. The first 3 states, South Carolina is diverse because there's a large African American population, but principally the state is white and African American. New Hampshire has modest diversity, Iowa has modest diversity. The first state where you get diversity, so the first 3 states that vote are Iowa first, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and then it comes out west to Nevada. The first diverse state you get is Nevada. Also, the first big U.S. metropolitan area in the top 30 in that cycle is Las Vegas. You want to guess the biggest metropolitan area before Las Vegas that votes? Greenville, South Carolina. And then Columbia, and then Des Moines. I'll tell you what, you want to win America, you win Las Vegas. You got to win Des Moines as well. But, we were speaking about this at dinner last night. And by the way, Greenville is 62nd ranked, just to put that in perspective. It's no guarantee that if you win a Las Vegas that you can go and win the Front Range of the Rockies, which has a pretty similar demographic profile in terms of Latinos, in terms of diversity, or the I-4 corridor in Orlando. But, because each set of politics is a little different. There's, here we have Yucca Mountain. If you make the wrong statement about Yucca Mountain, you wind up buried at Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain exists only to put politicians in permanent encampment politically, metaphorically, who mention Yucca Mountain positively within the state of Nevada. Some say that's changing. I don't know if it's true. The point is that if you can't win in Las Vegas because you make flip remarks regarding diversity, if you are insensitive to the population, if you alienate its voters, I would wager that chances are you're going to alienate voters of a similar background in other swing states. In other words, I don't think you don't have to play to every peculiarity of Southern Nevada or to the Front Range of the Colorado Rockies or to the I-4 corridor in Orlando. Rather, It's the opposite. If you begin a political process where you remove a very large and emerging share of that population and energize them, you will potentially forfeit those states. And I think that's part of the concern that the Republicans have at this point in their primary process. And finally, a couple of last points as far as the region itself. So in 2011, as was noted, we did a nice book, Brookings Press. Go buy the book. Please help the people at the Brookings Press buy the book. And it's on the America's New Swing region, which you're in, of course. Important here is that the southern Mountain West, the southern Rocky Mountains, the states in particular of Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada, which have, Colorado has 9 electoral votes, Nevada has 6, New Mexico has 5, has 20 electoral votes. They weigh against an Ohio. Ohio used to be the, if you can't win, I don't think any Republican president has ever won losing Ohio, if I'm not mistaken. If you win Ohio, so goes the nation. Well, there is a strategy now, and the Democrats know this strategy well, where this part of the southern Rocky Mountain West is a firewall to get to 270 electoral votes. And, you know, if you throw away these 3 states, certainly you risk, you know, if you lose in Ohio as well, or you lose Florida, you risk the presidency. But this is, and if you look at the simulations, this looks like a little bit more of a reliable region than some of the other parts of the country that the Democrats have been winning. So this is sort of, to the Democrats, money in the bank. And that people who come out here and make remarks regarding large sections of the population as non-participatory in the economy or engaged in criminal activity or other such things run the risk of branding a party or certainly their candidacy with some distance. And I'll make my final remarks, which is about the last several elections. So really the modern presidential era, I'd say post-1988. By the way, if you think back to 1988, how long ago was that? Cell phones were the size of Volkswagens. I'm not making that out, you can look that up. That's how big a cell phone was, as big as your head. They're getting big again, but now they're whole computers. They went through a whole cycle. So since 1988, the Democrats have won the presidency 4 of the 6 elections, but they won the popular vote 5 times, and they've won the Electoral College by over 330 points each time they won. The Republicans have only won the Electoral College by the maximum 286. And I'll leave you on this thought, and this relates to what Rui was saying. Mitt Romney won the white vote, the percentage of white vote in 2012, by the same percentage that Ronald Reagan did in the 1980 election against Jimmy Carter. And the election turned out differently for Reagan than it did for Romney, which is to say, winning the electorate, the white vote, up to what Reagan won in a landslide in 80, an electoral college blowout, a popular vote margin that was quite substantial, put him well behind the Democratic standard bearer in that year. So the point is that if you can't play these politics out here, and I'm not talking Iowa politics, and I'm not talking New Hampshire politics, you want to win those swing states as well. Iowa has 6 electoral votes, it's the same size as Nevada. But if you can't play these politics, you can start to get in trouble in the Mountain West. Certainly you could lose Florida and so on. So I'll leave you on that thought. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. Mentioning Yucca Mountain reminded me of my favorite Nevada politician, Chick Hecht. And I remember all those moments on the Senate floor when he would rail against the nuclear suppository. And not entirely wrong, I should add. Rob mentioned Kevin Phillips and the Sun Belt, but of course he was famous in that book for the Southern Strategy, which worked like a charm. It turned the South from an overwhelmingly Democratic region into what is now the driving base of the Republican Party. And what's so interesting about that first chart and the projections ahead is how many of those southern states that have been so firmly in the Republican camp are moving inexorably towards majority-minority status. And we will discuss, I think, a bit more what all of that means and whether there's a way of turning things around. But let's turn to Sam Sturgeon for some additional perspective.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we've talked a lot about race, and definitely there's been some very large demographic shifts with regard to race and ethnicity, but another one of those is kind of how we organize society around...
Move it a little bit closer.
A little bit closer. Okay, is that better? Yeah. Okay, how we organize families in society, looking at the married vote. So just really quickly, I've got this chart here that you can see Obama won the unmarried vote by a pretty significant margin. yes, Romney did win the married vote, as have most Republican candidates in recent elections. But we're starting to see that the unmarried vote is growing as a percent of the population. So if you see the next chart, and I apologize, in the legend I've got the colors mixed up, but green is currently married, orange is not currently married. And what I like to show these people is look where Obama's 51% came from. It came from about half married people and about half single people. That's not true for Romney's 47. Right? To get to his 47%, he only captured 14 of that was the single vote. Now, what's interesting about this is we find in marketing and messaging that a lot of times people will talk about, well, what is the Latino vote? What is the African American vote? What is the Asian vote? What are the issues that they're looking for? And we tend to find that you can actually divide this quite easily with the married and single vote. That married and single households often are looking at different issues, wanting different things. And one thing we're finding is that Republican candidates are failing to address the issues that single people have, and you kind of see that reflected here in this chart. So just really quickly, the next chart, this is just a scatter plot of states. The size of the dot is the size of the number of voters that voted in the last election. So we just ran this on one axis, the percent of the vote for Romney, the other axis, the percent of the population 15 and older that's currently married, and you get a pretty strong, rough correlation. Now, in many regards, this is an oversimplification. There's more to it than just being married and single, which also correlates with race and education and other things. But you do see this fairly robust correlation at the state level just by looking at the percent of people married and the ways that they will vote. And then the last chart I have in here, one way you could look at it is you could say marriage is in retreat, or you could say we're just starting to have more and more single households. And in fact, that is one of the biggest changes in demographics is the number of adults that live alone. That's, I believe now that's the largest single group of households anyway in America is people living alone. It's not a majority, but I believe it's the largest single group. But if you look at this, percentage of men and women of voting age that are currently married, in the 70s, that was close to 70% when you combine men and women. Now it's in the low 50s. So we're to a point in a couple years where less than half of the voting age population is likely to be married. Now, marrieds are still overrepresented in the electorate. In the last election, they were 60% of all votes cast. But you can still kind of see that trend. So it's important that this is another demographic change that we look at. And married households differ in a lot of ways. They tend to have more money. They tend to have increasingly two earners in the household. They tend to be more the tax base, and they tend to be less likely to, say, receive government benefits and whatnot. So you can see where they would have different issues on their mind than those in single households would. What's amazing is they don't tend to differ a lot on the presence of children. So yes, married households are slightly more likely to have children, but having children is not as strong a predictor of what your voting pattern or preferences look like. So anyway, I just want to make note of that. In addition to the racial and ethnic changes that Roy talked about, there's also a pretty substantial change in the percent of the population that's married.
That's terrific, thank you. Now, Carlin and I are going to ask a couple of questions of the panel, and then we'll open it up to you. And I have one for each of you. Rui, let me start with you. You spoke about the graying of America. We've had a long debate over whether as people get older, they get more conservative, or whether it's the cohort effect that matters the most. Your fusing of attitudes and partisanship according to the time when you came of age. So we've got this 2060, the point where we have a larger, older cohort. That's the youngest people in the electorate now. As we see this growth, is there anything we can say about what their political preferences are likely to be as we move towards that time?
Well, as a general rule, it's not the case that people automatically, as they age, become more conservative, or let's put it this way, reach the same level of conservatism, sort of no matter what generation they're from. And in fact, it matters quite a bit what generation you're from and your political behavior when you're younger, what your attitudes are when you're older. There may be some conservatizing effects, but by and large, a lot of these attitudes and these political behaviors are fairly sticky. Social attitudes are very sticky. Attitudes to the role of government are somewhat sticky. Voting behavior and partisanship are somewhat sticky. So it's not the case that the people who are seniors today are going to be the same as the people who are seniors 20 years from now. The people who are seniors 20 years from now may have different attitudes and vote in a different way. Now, as I kind of alluded to briefly in my remarks, that is not something that our simulations show you, at least the ones we put here on the handout. In fact, if you don't, because our simulations act like as soon as you get into an age group, you act like the people who currently do who are in that age group. So regardless of what generation you're from, once you get to be if you're a white, once you get to be a white 65-year-old, you vote like all white 65-year-olds do today. That's probably not a fair assumption. Probably they're going to be somewhat different. The most conservative generation in the electorate today is the silent generation, and they're the ones who dominate the senior age group. Once the baby boomers are the dominant element, we'll probably see the politics of seniors shift somewhat. And, behind that, the Xers and the millennials. So actually, I would expect there to be significant cohort effects on political behavior going forward that, as I said, we did not put in these particular simulations. We have done some simulations that do take the cohort effect into account, and if you take that into account, our estimations suggest that the hill becomes a bit steeper for Republicans because they don't get as much bang, as it were, out of the graying of the electorate as our estimations are currently allowing for. It's attenuated by the fact that these age groups are going to change in their generational composition, and that should, all else equal, shift some of these age groups to the left.
Okay. You guys have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, and it's always challenging doing projections, that one thing we tend to forget too is that the parties do change over time, but that's really hard to predict and really hard to take into account. So it's hard to say it's going to be one way with regard to partisanship because the parties can migrate.
Their attitudes may shift, which will affect the party.
Yes, absolutely. So you could see a scenario where, say, the whole country moves left. So, like the Republican Party could at some point move a little bit left and then begin to get more of that
Hard to
middle
believe
back.
now, I know, but it could happen.
Yeah.
So, Sam, I actually remember a couple of decades ago, Carlin was pointing out before most others that the marriage gap was more significant than the gender gap. And now, of course, the main change is that married and unmarried have flipped. But obviously, we have different categories of married or of unmarried. We have those who are widowed, those who are divorced. You've got those with children at home and those who don't. You have unmarried men and unmarried women. Are there significant differences that we can point out among those groups in terms of the politics? Is there, for example, more traction for Republicans with one group of unmarried people that they might move towards in terms of changing policies? Or is it simply the fact that you're untethered in that way and that alters your perceptions of politics?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because if you look at the 1970s, the majority of people that were single at that time was mostly because they had not married. But that's no longer the case. A good share of them is because they've never married, and we see the age at marriage kind of getting pushed back so that the median age of marriage is now 29 for men, 27 for women. But you're also seeing a good share of these single people are cohabiting, and so again, they've never married, but they have paired off, and in some ways they behave a lot like married households. But another thing you're seeing is because of divorce, a lot of people are single that weren't necessarily anticipating being single at, say, age 40, age 50, that historically wasn't the case. So there's been a lot of articles recently on, for example, the graying of divorce. So boomers divorcing in their 50s and 60s. So you're getting people newly single all across kind of the age cohort, all across the generational cohort. And then you're also going to have with boomers, it hasn't quite hit yet, but you're likely to get a fairly substantial population of single women that are widows, that have just outlived their husbands, just due to mortality tables, and that's the way it works. So I think, you're right, it wouldn't make sense to look at it as kind of a monolithic, married single group. But I think there are segments of singles, that would be more interested in current policies that Republicans have to offer than others. One of those, I think, would definitely be single men. Clearly, there's a lot of talk this last election that it wasn't just singles, but single women that voted for Obama in very high numbers. And what we've kind of found, and we're not the only ones to have found this, others have talked about it, but a lot of people view the Republican message as kind of saying, you're on your own. And that's a lot easier to do when you're a married couple, you have established household, you're building and looking to the future. So that message isn't as scary, but if you're, say, a single professional woman, just to kind of get this idea from a party that says you have to be your own safety net is a little intimidating, a little scary. So I think, that's one change or one way where they could begin to craft messaging to attract more of these single segments.
I'm waiting for the study that looks at divorced and widowed people who are on Tinder versus those who aren't. So for you, Rob, our former colleague Henry Olson a few years ago was pointing out that the Democrats' losses among working class whites were concentrated in the South, that it wasn't the same phenomenon outside the South. Now it certainly seems that that's changing. Talk a little bit about white voters and the differences across states and regions.
Yeah, so the flip side of diversity is white voters. And David DeMoore, a political science professor at UNLV, sitting right over there, he's trying to hide. And I wrote an academic piece that looks at, I mentioned New Hampshire and Vermont earlier. I mentioned New Hampshire and Iowa. Those are light minority populations, and Obama won both of them. And in fact, he won Vermont, he won Oregon, he won a bunch of states that were largely white. And then there are states, like if you look at the map that Rui passed around, Mississippi looks promising. It looks like there's a lot of minorities there. That's in the bank for the Republicans. And we looked at a lot of variables. We looked at education levels, income. What we found, and this took a lot of effort, we had to get a hold of a lot of people in cultural geography and sort of prove this, because this goes into academic work and you're going to get harangued by the faculty at other universities on this. What we looked at is a quality of northernness versus southernness. And, again, people would say, well, that's all irrelevant. That war was fought 150 years ago. For example, Nevada, whites in Nevada, are on the Union side of that divide. And whites in a state like Arizona were on the Confederate side of that divide. Now, how could the one battle of Picacho Peak, in 1862, result in some sort of long-standing, intergenerationally transferred, priority among whites to vote against, minority interests? What there is a kind of a doctrine in geography that says that New York City's tolerance stems from the Dutch. That there's a doctrine of people who first settle a state and organize its institutions, like, for example, in Utah. And that they replicate a lot of those values through those institutions. Not perfectly, and we don't argue that it's perfectly. But if you look, Arizona's mentioned as, boy, there's a state with a lot of minority population. How's that state coming along? It's coming along, but it's not like the Democrats are going to target it for 2016. Georgia, getting diverse in Atlanta beyond the black-white divide. Metro Atlanta now, apart from the rest of the state, Georgia looks promising as a swing state, but it's going to take more Latinos and Asians and Northern Yankees, and we even have a kind of index that says parts of North Carolina have been brought into Yankee land. Parts of Northern Virginia are brought into Yankee land. And so when we look even at the sub-regional level, what we find is this, that the degree to which you're part of a northern project, either historically or in a contemporary sense, it is a decently high predictor, better than some major other variables, in showing how you vote. So yes, the working class whites in the South were the origins of sort of, the white core of voters. That some of that is spread, some of that's spread with the Sun Belt to the west, some of that's, in the Northeast and Midwest dying industrial cities where there's a lot of people need answers to why their job isn't as good as it used to be or their parents were making out better than they were. All that being true, all that being aside, the fact is that diversity in and of itself does not predict a Democratic win. And I had a little doctrine that I said density, high density urban, plus diversity equal Democrats. But I can't apply that to Phoenix. I can't apply it to some place like, Dallas County, it works, but the rest of Texas is too big and overwhelms it. So I'd say, too, let's be cautious when we say diversity is everything. The characteristic of white voting patterns and the differences and subtleties and sub-regional flavors to that are determining also of elections.
One follow-up. What the States of Change report shows is that as the share of white votes declines, the share of white working class voters is declining more rapidly than that of college-educated voters. What do we know about the differences between white working class and white college-educated voters and Democrats' opportunity to hold on to those shares? Anybody?
The data are pretty clear on that. This is a change that's evolved since the late 80s, that by and large, Democrats do better among white college-educated voters than they do among white non-college or working-class voters, and that's pretty general. There are a few exceptions to that, like Minnesota and one or two others, but by and large, in most states, that's true, and the differences are typically significant. In Obama's first victory, for example, he only lost white college-educated voters by 4 points, and he lost white working-class voters by 18 points overall. It's a pattern replicated in state after state. Now, it's true that white working-class voters are worst for the Democrats in the South, but they're also relatively bad for them among white voters in almost every other state as well. In fact, the gap between white college-educated voters and white working-class voters in the non-South is actually larger than the gap between white college-educated and white working class in the South, because the Democrats do so crappy among whites of all kinds in the Deep South. But you go in the rest of the country, and it's clearly where the biggest vulnerabilities are in the white population. True in Nevada as well, I might add.
We want to turn to your questions, but I have two quick questions about Hispanics. I think we'd all agree that Hispanics right now are punching below their demographic weight electorally, and that's going to change considerably over time. Do we think that Hispanics who've been voting very Democratic, will have a distinctive political identity? Will they be like African Americans, or is the African American experience historically so distinct that Hispanics might not follow that pattern at all? And second, why do Texas Republicans do so well among Hispanics? Anybody?
Anyone else?
Three.
Okay.
No one wants to answer.
Hispanics in general, we would not expect them to reach the levels of Democratic support we see among blacks. That's not going to happen. I mean, now they're roughly 2-to-1 or more Democratic. It varies some by state, but by and large, that's the pattern. I wouldn't expect that to change in the near future, given the current political configurations of the Democratic and Republican parties. And not just because the Democrats are the more sympathetic party to immigrants, but also because of the innate political attitudes of Hispanics, who tend to be actually quite pro-government, pro-government services, quite pro-government activism, more so than any other minority group, as a matter of fact. So that's going to keep them on the Democratic side for a while. Now, I think as we were discussing earlier, if the configuration of the political parties starts to change and the Republicans try to put this group more in play, I don't think the nature of their loyalties are such to the Democratic Party that they can't be moved. Quite the contrary. I think if Republicans have a less viscerally anti-government kind of approach, I think they could definitely make some inroads into the Hispanic population. And I don't think it's not like an identity they're going to inherit for generations being Democrats. I think it's certainly open to change. As for why Texas Hispanics are somewhat more conservative than Hispanics in other parts of the country, I think that some of it has to do with the nature of the Republican Party in Texas. I think it's a little bit more porous and open to Hispanics. There may be some other reasons for it as well that I don't quite understand, but they're clearly more open to hearing from the Republican Party in Texas than Hispanics in other parts of the country. And, despite, I might add, the best efforts of parts of the Texas Republican Party to push them away. I mean, how long that can last, I don't know. We'll see what happens in the next election. I might add, we don't know how Texas Hispanics voted in 2012 because there was no Texas Hispanic there's no Texas exit poll, so we can only guess.
Yeah, and I would also add to that that Hispanics as a group is one of the most diverse ethnic groups out there, with immigrants from Mexico, but also immigrants that have lived in parts of Colorado that aren't even, I guess they're not even immigrants, Hispanics that have lived there for 200-300 years. So that's something to keep in mind too, that you get a different flavor of Hispanic depending on where you are in the country. So I think it's important to note that diversity.
And just to finish that, Santa Fe is older than Boston. You know that, right? Santa Fe is an older city than Boston. So the Mexican state, and originally Spain, that reached into the Southwest has left rural populations in states like Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico that are essentially, rural voters and vote in a pattern that seems a little more like that than they do. Some of the border issues in Texas are a little different, but the plains parts of Texas aren't that way. And then also, again, the point is well taken. Look at a state like Florida. So 2 big Hispanic groups there, Cubans, Miami, Puerto Ricans, Orlando. Those 2 don't vote the same, and yet they're both Hispanic. So it's too big. When you get to that large a share of the U.S. population, you can no longer make sort of monolithic statements about the group.
And you could also add that second and third generation Cuban Americans are voting very differently from the first generation. Let's open it up to the audience for questions. I think we're going to have a mic roaming around that Heather has, and please identify yourself before you ask the question. We've got about 20 minutes or so for some additional dialogue.
I'm Gregory Brown, professor of history at UNLV.
Speak up a little, can't hear you.
I'm Gregory Brown, a professor of history at UNLV.
Yes.
My question is somewhat anticipated by your final comment about Cuban American voters, and my question was about foreign policy. Arguably one of the bulwarks of the democratic majorities of the 20th century was the party's association with an activist interventionist foreign policy in Europe, and strong segments of European Americans were loyal to the Democratic Party for that reason. As we see a pivot to Asia, or obviously for the last 20 years or so, Middle East, is there any evidence that any of the surveys look at the potential influence of American foreign policy and the associations of each party with certain policy positions on some of the demographic subpopulations?
So the question is about the impact of foreign policy, and obviously we have the pivot to Cuba as well as the pivot to Asia. We have the turmoil in the Middle East. We have the long-standing, multi-generational hope of the Republican-Jewish coalition that finally Jews would move over to the Republican side, which is a bit like searching for the Holy Grail and never seems to come along. Any comments about the role of foreign policy when it comes to some of the groups we've been talking about?
Well, famously, obviously, Cubans were in a great state, a swing state like Florida, and delivered essentially the 2000 election to Bush. And the politics of Cuba remained the same till Obama. There's also issues when, just since the Middle East was brought up, there's also, the Electoral College is so weird because it could put a subpopulation in a state like Michigan, which has a large Arab population, and you could make a flip remark about, I don't think somebody of a certain background ought to get to be president of the United States. And the parents of those children who are native born to the United States who have that ethnicity, they don't ever forget that. In fact, I was in Virginia when Allen, in 2006, changed the composition of the U.S. Senate by referring to a kid named, he called him Macaca, which it took forever. It was apparently, not a very nice comment to make, of Algerian Jewish origin or some obscurity like that. And the parents were interviewed in the Washington Post. They were like just upstanding citizens of Fairfax County, Virginia, and they recalled the way their child was referred to by a Senate candidate. And it played out in the Washington Post, it played out in the regional dialogue. So the issue is, it's not just foreign affairs, it's the subpopulations connected to those foreign affairs. So you get in a heated exchange and you say, well, so-and-so about the Middle East, and you make a flip remark, and the next thing you know, guess what? If I were the Republicans, I'd start to move Michigan towards the we're not going to compete there category after some of the comments that have been made recently.
Over here. The distinguished man in the front. Distinguished older man in the front.
Yes, exactly. Hey,
a baby
hi, Ron
boomer.
Brownstein, National Journal. I actually have a question more for Carlin and Norm. There have been, from your perch at AEI, there's been a lot of debate in the Republican Party since 2013 about whether the way back to the White House is by reaching out to more minority voters, or whether a more promising strategy is essentially a whites-only strategy and looking to get that 5-point increase in the white share of the vote that would take you up to Reagan in '84. Many conservatives like the white-only strategy because it doesn't require you to change a lot of policy and try to reach out on issues like immigration. I'm interested in your take on the state of the debate in the Republican Party among the leading Republican thinkers and strategists. Which view is ascendant? That the party has to reach out to minorities to win the White House back, or that there are, in fact, 6 million or more whites, particularly blue-collar whites, who can be motivated to come out with a more ideological message?
So I should note that no journalist has written more and better about demographics and votes than Ron Brownstein for National Journal. The question is, which strategy would work best for the Republican Party? Aiming at picking up that extra 5 to 7% of white voters and either ignoring or basically moving away from minorities, or changing not just rhetoric but policy to try to appeal more to white voters. Carlin, you want to start?
I think in 2016, Republicans will work on doubling down on the white vote. Seems pretty clear, but I think there's a generational divide among Republicans and conservatives, and younger Republicans and conservatives absolutely know they've got to reach out more to minorities or they're toast.
You know, it's interesting, the very poorly named autopsy of the Republican Party done by Reince Priebus. Why would you want to suggest that your party is analyzing a dead body? But that made this strong pitch that we have to do more to appeal to minorities has clearly been pretty much thrown out the window in this intense debate among 15 people to win a Republican nomination. And I would say one of the great dangers here, we know that people as they come of age politically fuse in an identity that becomes much more difficult to change down the road. If you vote 3 times in a row for a party, that's likely it. So there's a danger if you turn really shrill, even over a brief period of time. If your slogan is "Take our country back," which I think to most minorities means take our country back from us, and you talk about rapists, Mexican rapists, and you have a tilt in a different direction, that's dangerous not just for one election, but for future ones. But in the short run, I think as these state numbers that Rui projected suggest, that doesn't mean you can't compete very significantly for a presidential victory now. One other point. Just one other point about Asians. In 2012, I talked to a lot of the Romney people, and they were confident going into election eve that while they wouldn't do much better among Hispanics, they were really going to do better among Asian Americans, which Obama had carried 2-1 in 2008. Because here was a group of people who were upwardly mobile, entrepreneurial, really would resonate to that message. And they did more poorly. And one reason, as our former colleague Henry Olson pointed out, is if your message is we're a Christian nation or a Judeo-Christian nation, you're appealing to a group of people, about 30% of whom are Christians, that also is saying you're not like us. And there are other reasons as well, but I think it's a challenge.
Just to add one more point on that, it's interesting that white millennials voted for Romney, including young white women, whom so many people think of as quite liberal, and they voted only by a single percentage point. Young white men voted quite heavily for Romney, but again, they've cast their votes for Republicans. What that means going forward, I think it remains to be seen.
Could I say a word about that? It's incontrovertibly true based on our simulations, and common sense would suggest this too. It's a more effective strategy to jack up your vote among whites by 5 points than it is to jack up your vote among Hispanics and Asians by even a greater amount than that, like 7.5 as we had in our estimations, or just many more white voters. Now, there's a couple of questions you can ask about that. One is, how easy is it to get to 64% of the white vote? You're already at 59%. I mean, doubling down on the white vote, what does that mean? Who are those 5 points worth of white voters out there who are just chafing at the bit to vote Republican and just need you to be more aggressive in your pitch? I'm not sure that's that easy. I don't think they're necessarily hanging from the trees. In fact, you could just alienate some of these more moderate white voters by insisting that only the Republicans are your party. The second thing I would observe is that there's no reason to preclude a both and strategy. It doesn't have to be either or. Simulations that we don't show here and we will eventually report indicate, without saying much more about it, that a very effective strategy for the Republicans in 2016 could be to increase their vote among whites by a more modest amount, like say 3 points, and increase their vote among Hispanics and Asians by say 4 or 5 points. That might work pretty well. So there's no reason to choose. You could potentially try to do both, just as a, it could happen kind of thing. I'm not saying that will happen, but it could be done.
Just to follow up, in terms of that was something else I was going to ask, and you point toward it, do they have a better chance of increasing their white vote by going on a kind of a hard-edged, conservative, nativist message aimed primarily at blue-collar whites? Or do they have a better chance of increasing their white vote by going to a more inclusive message, culturally and socially and ethnically more inclusive, that aims to perhaps to get more upscale whites who already lean toward them on fiscal issues? Which one is a more promising path? Because the first one would in fact probably be incompatible with increasing your minority vote in any way.
So the question is, do Republicans have a better chance taking a hard edge, kind of a nativist approach to increase the white vote, or moving in a different, in many ways more subtle direction? Carlin, you wanted to respond.
I think that the latter strategy is probably the better strategy going forward. Republicans are moving on a lot of the immigration issues, the party as a whole. The primary process pulls both parties to their extremes. We've seen that over and over again, and then they scramble back for the center in a general election. And I think Republicans on some of the immigration issues are actually moving in a more liberal direction nationally.
And I'd say, too, just to answer that question, you get potentially 2 voters if you go more sensitive on the minority issue and you go less hard edge, because you pick up college-educated northern whites who watch how you treat minorities, and I've seen that in Northern Virginia's political process, and you pick up potentially the minority because you're no longer alienating the minority. It seems like a bigger pool because there's 2 opportunities for a gain, whereas there's only 1 opportunity for a gain by drilling down and going harder, more shrill on white nativists.
I think it's worth pointing out that, one, immigration is not the only issue. If you're looking at a way of trying to build a base among minority voters, immigration is a symbol and a real problem, but then you're going to have to try and make a broader appeal to the larger economic issues that face them, and that means more than just rhetoric. The other problem, I think, the great dilemma for Republican presidential candidates now, as we see in Congress as well, is that the drivers, the activists, take the hardest edge on immigration. And I think that's why a Donald Trump, whose views on many other issues do not fit with the Tea Party conservatives, is able to build that level of enthusiasm because it's the hardest edge on immigration that gives him support. When you have an Ann Coulter, who admittedly shouldn't be taken as an opinion leader, saying, if Trump follows through on immigration, I don't care if he performs abortions in the White House. That's Ann Coulter, but it's also telling you that for a very significant share of voters, capturing their enthusiasm means moving in a direction that is very counterproductive in other ways.
Yeah, and I think I would also add to that just really quickly that it also depends on the age of the voters. That I think if you give a message of exclusivity, you're going to lose a lot of millennial voters in particular. So there's a caution in doing that.
Sir.
Bernie Malamud, UNLV Economics. My question has to do with the difference between voting age population and voters. The analysis that seems to have been presented works on voting age population, but then we know that not everybody gets to register and not everybody who registered gets to vote, and how that slippage might affect outcomes.
Good question. It's about the difference between voting age population and voters. The report has a lot on those differences, but Carlin, why don't
No,
you?
I won't. No, you go to the other end.
Anybody?
Well, yeah, I mean, the big difference, of course, is that the voting age population is going to include a greater proportion of Hispanics and Asians, because a lot of them tend not to be citizens. So, but one thing we know is that over time, that gap is going to narrow, because most of the increase in the Hispanic and Asian population is going to come from fertility. So those people are citizens. I mean, they're voters the moment they turn 18. So the gap between the voting age population and eligible voters is going to narrow over time. Now it's fairly substantial. I should add, though, that the simulations we do are all based on eligible voters. Most of our charts are based on eligible voters. It is true, though, that if you look at the, for example, if you compare the change that's going to take place in populations as a whole and how quickly they're going to become majority-minority, the rate at which we're going to become majority-minority eligible voters is actually it's a faster rate, but it starts from a lower level. So in other words, there's a lag time between when the population of a state becomes majority-minority and when it becomes majority-minority eligible voters. And that varies by state between 7, 8, 9, 10, even 12 years. So all that data, I might add, is in this handy-dandy report. Every state, every group, it's all there. So if you want the complete story, that's where you go.
And I would just add, there's a pretty substantial difference between midterm and presidential elections, obviously, where voter turnout in midterms tends to be much more different than the population at large relative to presidential election years.
And as immigration slows, more minorities who were previous immigrants and their children become voter eligible. And I think Bill Fry has a little equation back. Bill Fry is a colleague of mine at the Brookings Institution that many of us know, of how many per hour Romney voters are dying and being replaced by somebody who's got one or two foreign-born parents, and who's a millennial. Now, millennials don't vote. Voter eligibility is lower because of the share of foreign-born children in that population. But you can see the handwriting on the wall. It doesn't take that many cycles for it to play out.
So if you're a Romney voter, go to @BillFry to find out what your likely life expectancy is. Question.
Sure. Hi, Miles Dixon. I'm curious, as you look at the changing demographics, would you mind offering some reflections or thoughts on if, when, and what is necessary for it to happen to see more diversity in Congress itself? When will the changes in demographics show up in Congress, if ever? And what do we have to do to make that possible?
So the question is, when, if ever, will the changes in population and the growing diversity reflect themselves in diversity inside Congress? And I think, the answer to that is there will be a very, very long lag. And we're going to have an increasing tension, as we've already seen, over the Voting Rights Act and questions of redistricting, where what we've seen over the last couple of decades is an alliance between Republicans and especially African Americans, in some cases Hispanic Americans, to create more majority-minority districts. But now some backlash against that, because it basically involves packing minorities into districts and giving Republicans more opportunities to win more seats. And if you look at diversity across party lines, you're not seeing very much of it at all on the Republican side. And you're going to see some pushback on the Democratic side. And we're seeing with some of the court cases moving forward. And look at the Supreme Court this term, by the way, for some modest answers to these questions, including a couple of cases involving both redistricting, but especially the Voting Rights Act, for some clues as to where we go on that front. What we're also seeing is in some states, in Virginia, where we have a case moving forward, but where they now have to redo the district lines because they violated the Voting Rights Act, you've got a growing Hispanic population very substantially in Northern Virginia. And some of the plans that are potentially out there will likely create a district that would have a Hispanic having more traction there. So I think we're going to see slowly more diversity in Congress, but it's going to lag way behind what's happening in the population as a whole.
And because there's no gerrymandering in the Electoral College, you see diversity more easily reflected in presidential votes. Witness Obama.
Yes. We have a question here, and then another question here.
Put a couple on the
Yes.
table.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, let's do, if we could, because we want to keep to our time frame, take both of these questions and then we'll get responses. from the
Perfect.
panel.
So Scott Lucas, Las Vegas Sun, question is about critical realignment elections. It's a concept maybe more popular among journalists than political scientists, but two parts. What was the one that set off these trend lines? Was it 1980 or something more recent? And two, what are the prospects of a realignment election hitting either in this cycle or cycles moving forward?
So, question about critical elections and realigning elections, and this young lady.
My question was, how do those, I'm sorry, Maria Shagag, UNLV. My question was, how do you integrate those who don't identify as Latino or Black or white because they're of mixed heritage? How do they come into the whole voting trends?
Good question about as we do these categorizations and we have increasing mixed race couples and a lot of diversity there, how do people get characterized? And we'll take one more question here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Karen Danielson, UNLV. I wanted to go back to the Voting Rights Act. The Brennan Center showed that 41 states have enacted some sort of voting restriction since 2012. How do you think that's going to affect both the diversity of the electorate and how many people are actually going to be able to be eligible to vote?
Okay, so that question was about the vast number of states, as the Brennan Center report and others have pointed out, that have enacted different kinds of voting restrictions, and what impact will that have on turnout and on some of these elections. So we have a question about critical and realigning elections, a question about in a society where interracial relationships have increased dramatically. I think it's one of the most important social trends. How do we categorize people? And then one about voting restrictions. So let's open to anybody on the panel who wants to address them.
Well, just a demographic fact, more than a quarter of Asians and Hispanics, recent newlyweds, married someone of a different race or ethnicity. So it's really a growing phenomenon, very important.
Anybody want to talk about realigning elections or critical elections? Does anybody see 2016 as equivalent of 1980?
Well,
or
this may seem
1932?
strange coming from someone who co-wrote the Emerging Democratic Majority, but I actually don't really believe in critical elections. I think the political scientists have looked at this pretty carefully. David Mayhew wrote a remarkable book called Electoral Realignments, which is well worth reading as an exercise in almost theoretical nihilism, but I think his points are well taken. It really is difficult to fit these elections into a specific kind of pattern that would seem to be a common trope in general, like 20 or 30 years ago. I think it lives on, at least among journalists and some other people. But I think there's really no point in trying to put these elections into boxes. The concept of realignment is poorly defined. I think that there are times in American politics where it shifts in the direction of one party, at least on some levels of government. Other times when it might shift in another direction. They have greater or lesser durations. Sometimes they have demographic underpinnings, as I think we're seeing now. Other times there may be other things going on. It's complicated. So I think to look for critical elections is kind of a fool's errand, and I certainly don't think 2016 is likely to qualify. I can say something about these other two questions, or we can...
I want to comment on the second question.
Okay, well, why don't you...
Okay.
Yes.
So the question on mixed race is interesting. And so you have the option in the census of doing multi-race. Some people pick it, some people don't. There's also the fact that Latinos are an ethnic identity, and then Latinos get to pick a race. And a large block of Latinos do not pick race. The largest share that pick are white, that pick race, but then it's just a bare majority. and then a large section of Latinos don't pick race, but the assumption is that a significant share of that is non-reported white. So technically, Latino whites and the white vote is growing in a counterintuitive way in the United States. Then there's the issue of mixed or multi-race couples and multi-race identity, some of which is reflected. So for example, President Obama selects African American, and yet he could, if he chose to, pick multiracial background, but he chooses not. So we don't have those figures. And here's the important point of it all. It just shows you that, one, it's tough to work at the US Census Bureau because it's a wild and crazy country. And two, just like it used to matter that you were a Southern and Eastern European and you were separate from Northwest Europeans in whiteness in the early 20th century, go ask Senator McCarran, who was on that like you cannot believe, who the airport's named for. So too will probably emerge in mid-21st century a notion of such complexity that some of our categories will seem antique, almost quaint and non-predictive.
Okay, a couple of comments, one on the critical elections. We live in a world now where the midterm electorate is so different from the presidential election year electorate that suggesting that there's a realignment that really moves the parties in one direction, we're still going to see vast differences in midterm outcomes from presidential year outcomes. And what that means is that a party may not get a signal that they're on the losing end of the stick if they keep winning the House of Representatives, winning gubernatorial elections, winning state houses. And on the voter restriction laws, here, a critical Supreme Court decision on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is going to send a broad signal. And here too, I would say, especially for the Republican Party, if you want to broaden your base, you've got two ways to go, or win elections. One way is to broaden your base by changing both your rhetoric and your policies to appeal to a wider group. The second is to make sure that the emerging group that won't vote for you doesn't turn out in such substantial numbers. And I think we're at a crossroads on that front. What we did see in 2012 and 2014 is actually significant increases in minority votes because you had an electorate angry at what they saw as restrictions and a massive effort to get them to turn out. How long that continues is one of the more important questions in our broader politics.
But I think it's also important, Norm, to point out that even very tight voter restrictions have broad public support, very tight restrictions.
And with that, we've gone about 3 minutes over, and I apologize for that because we need to keep on time here in the Mountain West. Thank you all for coming and for your attention, for your wonderful questions.
You're a great moderator.
You are too.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.